many of you have ever worked on a project and you needed a piece of information to support that project, and once you found it, you kept looking for more? I see a few heads nodding out there. Well, that happened to me on an art project I was working on in 2019. Because 2019 was the 100th anniversary of Congress passing the 19th Amendment, I wanted to find an African American woman from Dayton, Ohio, as the subject for my art piece that had been involved in suffragist activities. I wasn't even sure somebody like that existed. So I started my internet search with as precisely a worded question as I could. And I hit pay dirt. I found a document entitled Diversity and Women's Suffrage, a case study of the DWSA, the Dayton Women's Suffrage Association. You can't get much better than that. Throughout that document, a name kept appearing, and it was the name of Julia Ann Galloway Higgins. Her name most often appeared in excerpts from the DWSA's meeting minutes. By the way, those minutes are actually housed upstairs on the second floor in the Dayton room. One particular entry, though, was what I needed for my inspiration. It read, and I quote, July 22nd, 1912. The colored women of Dayton, under the direction of Mrs. Higgins, are requested to manage the information booth on Mondays. That was all I needed for the inspiration to create my hand-embroidered piece of artwork entitled Mondays at the Booth. Like I said, I kept looking for more and more information, and that led me to 95-year-old Betty Jean Duggar Ferguson, who has since passed, but she happened to be the granddaughter of Mrs. Higgins. Lucky again. I was able to arrange a meeting with Mrs. Ferguson, and during that hour, she told me many things, but the one thing that really stuck in my mind was that her mother, when she was a little girl, used to accompany Mrs. Higgins to the booth. That's how the little girl in the yellow dress playing jacks got into the picture. I usually have the television on when I'm sewing. I use it for something to rest my eyes when I need to look up from the tedious needlework, or sometimes it's just there for background noise. One evening, I was looking for something to watch, and I ran across a title that ordinarily would not have caught my attention. But the name of the movie was Suffragette, of all things. The movie is about a young woman named Maud who joins the suffragettes in hopes that she's going to find something that's going to help her get more control over the circumstances of her life. But it turns out, though, that ends up costing her her job, her marriage, and ultimately her son. I was mesmerized. Needless to say, I didn't get much needlework done that night. But it did awaken a deeper curiosity in me to learn more about the women's movement to gain the vote. On August 18, 1920, the state of Tennessee cast the final vote ratifying the 19th Amendment. In her book, The Woman's Hour, Elaine Weiss details the relentless opposition that the movement received from politicians, religious leaders, business owners, and educators, and also from the racists among them who did not want to see black women get the vote. And all across the country, in newspapers, the editorial sections also contained cartoons about the movement. One such cartoon was about the antis, Those were women who were thoroughly against the movement, who didn't want to see the status quo of their lives changed. Another cartoon gave us a picture of what life was going to look like for the husbands once their wives got the vote. And still another cartoonist was so bold as to suggest what should happen to the suffragists. And you can see those pants over there. They were wondering who's going to finally wear the pants in the family once women get the vote. But then there were sketches like these also that reminded people that there were actually white women who didn't want to see black women get the vote. On November 2nd, 1920, 10 million women went to the polls to cast their first ballots. But there were another 20 million women who didn't even go to the polls. Opponents of the movement looked at those statistics and said, see there, women really didn't want to vote anyway. But the proponents of the movement blamed the low turnout on several things. One was the short time frame between August and November in which they had to get women registered to vote. The other, once again, those antis, they were actually at the polls sometimes barring the entrance to the doorway to the polling location. Letters were actually mailed to black women, telling them that they could be subject to fines and even jail time if the smallest error were found in their registration documents. And then there were violent threats made to black men and women who were simply holding classes to teach their neighbors how to fill out those documents. In a small town in Georgia, oh no, that's Florida. In a small town in Florida, 50 black men and women actually paid the ultimate price for ignoring those warnings. There have also been less violent tactics used to suppress the vote. A poll tax, charging black people to actually place a vote. Literacy tests, making people take a literacy test before they could place their vote, and sometimes even if they passed the test, they weren't allowed to take the vote. Multiple forms of identification also sometimes prevented people from voting. And then there were arbitrary tactics thought up by local officials to keep their black neighbors from voting. In 1944, while my father-in-law was serving overseas in World War II, my mother-in-law went home to a small town in Georgia to live with her mother. Her mother owned and successfully ran the small farm she lived on that she had inherited when her husband passed. She was well known in the community and respected, if for nothing else, the generosity that she showed to both her black neighbors and white neighbors who were less fortunate than she. Like I said, she was well known. When they went to the polls to vote, my grandmother-in-law had a premonition that something additional was going to be required of her when she got there. She didn't really know what it was, but she happened to just think to take the deed to the property that actually showed her name on it. On that particular voting day, the local officials had decided that the only black people, men or women, that would be allowed to vote would be black property owners, but they would have to have proof with them that they actually owned that property. Even though they knew her well, When my grandmother-in-law got there, they still asked for proof of property ownership. And to their surprise, she had it. She was allowed to vote that day, but my mother-in-law, who didn't have such a document, was denied her right. There have also been other groups of American citizens that have been denied their right. Native Americans did not get their full voting rights until 1962, and to this day, some of them are still having trouble. Asian Americans didn't get their right to vote until a series of laws was passed between 1943 and 1952. There are also modern day techniques to keep people from voting, like purging the voting rolls and gerrymandering districts. Unequal allocation of voting equipment at the polls, and when some of that equipment goes down, long lines get formed. And then there are the restriction of early voting days. Here in Ohio, a law was passed that on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday prior to Election Day, those days were eliminated as early voting days. That had the effect of shutting down a program called Souls to the Polls, Get Out the Vote, where on Sunday afternoons after church services, Black church members got together in groups and they went to the polls to cast their vote. Fortunately, that law was overturned in 2014. And then there are the instances where just faulty and shady information is provided to prospective voters. Sometimes it's when to vote. Sometimes it's how to vote. We're not texting yet, and there's no electronic means of voting yet. Just ask the state of Iowa. And then there's just the thousands and thousands of instances where bad addresses have been provided. Mistake or on purpose? I've been doing, believe it or not, some form of needlework for about 60 years. And in the last 6 years, I've participated in 3 art projects that have required me to do some research, either for inspiration or to justify the subject that I've chosen for my artwork. In the case of Mondays at the Booth, though, I'm not so sure that what I created is as important as what I learned while I was creating it. And that was about a movement that prior to that I had very little interest in. And that was the 19th Amendment and the 2 centuries-long effort that it took to get that amendment passed. Something else occurred to me along the way, and it's that no matter your race, color of your skin, ethnic origin, or gender, getting the right to do something does not necessarily guarantee your ability to exercise that right. Let me say it again. Getting the right to do something does not necessarily guarantee your ability to exercise that right. Opposition will come from many sources and in many forms, some that you least expect. But during that, we must all stay vigilant. At a minimum, if you see something wrong, you need to say something about it to somebody who can do something about it. And in order to recognize when something is wrong, we all need to stay woke.